Physics, explained simply building, unshakable mental resilience. The Feynman way here is something that will sound completely backwards. The most intellectually confident person in any room is usually the one most comfortable saying, "I don't know." Sit with that for a second, because everything we've been told about confidence, about expertise, about projecting authority, it points in exactly the opposite direction. We've been taught to fake it till we make it, to never show weakness, to defend our positions with ferocity, to perform certainty even when we feel none. And that performance is destroying us. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner, Manhattan Project physicist, bongo drummer, safecracker, and arguably the greatest science communicator who ever lived, operated by a completely different code. He was famous for saying things like, "I don't know," in front of audiences of thousands. He would stop mid-lecture, visibly confused by his own train of thought, and say, "Wait, let me think about this differently." And somehow, instead of losing the room, he gained it. Why? Because real confidence isn't the absence of doubt. Real confidence is the ability to be honest about what you know, what you don't know, and why the difference matters. Today, we're going to unpack that. We're going to look at how Feynman built the kind of mental toughness that made him impervious to intellectual attack, immune to imposter syndrome, and genuinely, authentically sure of himself in a way that no amount of credential collecting or ego performance could ever replicate. And, more importantly, we're going to look at how you can build the same thing. Let's start with a question that probably hits closer to home than you'd like. Have you ever been in a conversation, a meeting, a class, a dinner table debate, where you knew you understood something, you were pretty sure you were right, but the moment someone pushed back with confidence, you started to fold? Not because they made a good argument, just because they seemed so certain, so authoritative, so unworried about being wrong. That's not a character flaw. That's a deeply human response to social pressure. We are wired to interpret confidence as a signal of correctness. It's baked into our evolutionary history. The confident person in the tribe probably did know where the food was. Following them made sense. But in intellectual life, in science, in philosophy, in any domain where truth is complicated, that instinct becomes a liability. Because the loudest person in the room is rarely the one with the most accurate map of reality. They're usually just the one most committed to their current map. Feynman understood this at a bone-deep level. He grew up in Far Rockaway, Queens, with a father who taught him something extraordinary. His father, Melville Feynman, never let young Richard confuse the name of a thing with the understanding of a thing. He would say, knowing the name of a bird in every language tells you nothing about the bird. Feynman carried that lesson his entire life, and it became the foundation of something remarkable, a mind that could hold enormous knowledge and enormous humility simultaneously without any contradiction. So what exactly is mental resilience in an intellectual context? Let's be precise here, because this word gets used so loosely it's almost meaningless. Mental resilience, in the Feynman sense, is not stubbornness. It's not refusing to change your mind. It's not aggressiveness or dominance, or the ability to out-argue anyone in the room. Mental resilience is the stable inner structure that lets you engage with challenges, even devastating ones, without losing your footing. It means you can hear you're wrong without collapsing into shame or hardening into defensiveness. You can say, "I don't know," without feeling like a fraud. You can be corrected and feel genuinely grateful, not diminished. Think of it like this. Imagine two trees in a storm. One tree is rigid, dense, fighting the wind with sheer mass. The other is flexible, rooted deeply, bending with the wind without breaking. Which one survives the storm? The flexible one almost always. The rigid tree, if the wind is strong enough, snaps. The flexible tree loses nothing but its composure for a moment, and then it stands back up. Feynman was that second tree, and the roots, the thing that kept him grounded through every intellectual storm, were not his credentials, not his reputation, not other people's approval. They were his direct, personal, verified understanding of things. He trusted his own cognition because he had tested his own cognition over and over again. Let's talk about the imposter syndrome problem specifically, because if you've ever felt it, and the research suggests nearly everyone has, you know how paralyzing it can be. Imposter syndrome, at its core, is the persistent belief that your competence is an illusion, that you somehow fooled everyone into thinking you belong, and that eventually, inevitably, someone is going to figure it out. The interesting thing is that imposter syndrome is almost always found in people who are actually competent. The less competent someone is, the less likely they are to experience it, because they lack the self-awareness to perceive the gap between their performance and the standard. This is sometimes called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and its mirror image is just as real. The more you actually know, the more aware you become of how much you don't know, and the more that awareness can be twisted into a sense of inadequacy. Now here's where Feynman's approach becomes genuinely revolutionary. Feynman experienced doubt. Of course he did. He was a physicist. Doubt is the engine of the whole enterprise. But his doubt never converted into shame, because he had built his confidence on a foundation that couldn't be taken away from him. Not by a critic, not by a failed experiment, not by a smarter colleague. That foundation was this: he knew what he understood, specifically, precisely. He had drawn a clear, honest map of his own knowledge, including all the blank spaces. And those blank spaces didn't scare him, they interested him. Think about that as a practice. Not do I know enough, which is a question with no answer, because there is always more. But do I actually understand the things I think I understand? That's a question you can test. That's a question you can answer honestly. And answering it honestly, however uncomfortable, builds something that no amount of credential collecting can build: genuine epistemic self-trust. Here's a thought experiment Feynman might have offered. Imagine you've just studied quantum mechanics for 6 months. You've read the textbooks, passed the exams, you can write out the equations. Now someone at a party asks you, so in your own words, without any equations, what is quantum mechanics actually saying about reality? Do you freeze? Most people do. And that freeze is telling you something important. It's telling you there's a gap between what you can recite and what you actually understand. Feynman called this the difference between knowing the name and knowing the thing. His famous self-test, now called the Feynman technique, was simple. Take any concept you think you understand. Try to explain it to a child or to someone with no background in the subject. Wherever you stumble, wherever the explanation gets vague or you retreat into jargon, that's where your understanding has a hole. Go back to the source material. Fill the hole. Try again. Do this enough times and something remarkable happens. You stop being afraid of questions because you've already asked yourself harder ones than anyone else is likely to ask. You stop being afraid of being wrong because you've already been wrong dozens of times in private and come out the other side with better understanding. The process of testing yourself relentlessly is immunizing. Each time you find a gap and fill it, your confidence grows. Not because you now know everything, but because you know the territory of your own knowledge with precision. That's a very different kind of confidence from I've read enough books to sound smart at dinner parties. That kind of confidence is brittle. One sharp question, and it shatters. Feynman's kind of confidence was unshatterable, because it was built on honest self-assessment rather than performance. Now let's talk about handling criticism. Because this is where most of us really struggle. There are two kinds of criticism that come at you in intellectual life, and treating them the same way is a catastrophic mistake. The first kind is substantive criticism. Someone has found a genuine flaw in your reasoning. They can point to it specifically. They're not attacking you, they're attacking an idea, and the idea happens to be one you hold. This kind of criticism is a gift. It is genuinely, unambiguously useful. And the correct response to it is gratitude, followed by careful examination, followed by updating your position if the criticism holds up. Feynman modeled this beautifully. He would regularly change his mind in public. He would say, "Oh, you're right, I hadn't thought of it that way," with what seemed like genuine pleasure. Not the performed graciousness of someone trying to seem magnanimous, actual pleasure. Because to Feynman, being corrected meant he was about to understand something better than he did 30 seconds ago. That was exciting to him. The second kind is what we might call social criticism. It's the intellectual attack dressed up in the costume of argument. The person isn't really engaging with your ideas. They're trying to establish dominance or embarrass you or demonstrate their own superiority to an audience. The argument is just a vehicle for the aggression. These two types require completely different responses, and learning to tell them apart is one of the most important intellectual skills you can develop. Here's how you tell them apart. Ask yourself, is this person actually engaging with the specific content of what I said? Can they point to a precise logical flaw or factual error? Or are they being vague, dismissive, attacking my credentials rather than my argument? Or trying to make me feel stupid rather than helping me think better? Substantive criticism is surgical. Social criticism is atmospheric. One targets an idea, the other targets a person. Feynman's response to social criticism was almost legendary in its simplicity. He didn't engage with it emotionally. He would calmly ask for specifics. What exactly is wrong with the argument? If they couldn't produce specifics, the criticism evaporated. He didn't need to win. He didn't need to humiliate the person back. He just needed to stay grounded in the actual substance of the question, and that groundedness was itself a kind of armor. Stop. Think about that for a moment. The reason intellectual attacks feel so threatening is usually not that they've found a genuine flaw in your thinking. It's that they've triggered your fear of being exposed as inadequate. They've poked at the part of you that doesn't fully trust its own competence. And here is the profound thing, that fear feeds on opacity. It feeds on not knowing the precise edges of your own knowledge. The vaguer your self-assessment, the more vulnerable you are to anyone who projects confidence. But the moment you have mapped your knowledge honestly, when you know exactly what you understand, why you understand it, and where the legitimate uncertainty begins, that fear has nowhere to root. Because you already know what you don't know, the critic can't expose what you've already acknowledged. This is what Feynman meant when he said, in various ways throughout his life, that the first step to knowledge is knowing what you are ignorant of. The I don't know is not a concession. It is a fortress. Let's go deeper into this because there's something here that runs counter to everything most educational systems teach. We are trained to perform certainty. From the time we're in school, we are rewarded for having the right answer and penalized for not knowing. Saying, I don't know in a classroom is embarrassing. Changing your answer is weakness. Being wrong is shameful. And what this training produces is a generation of highly educated people who are terrified of uncertainty, who confuse confidence with correctness, who mistake the feeling of knowing for actual knowledge, who will defend a position not because they thought it through carefully, but because changing their mind would feel like losing. Feynman's entire career was a repudiation of this model. He once said that he would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. That's not a rhetorical flourish. That's a description of how he actually operated. He genuinely found the unanswered question more interesting than the settled answer. Now, you might be thinking that's easy for a genius to say. If you're Feynman, you can afford to say, I don't know, because your credentials are so overwhelming that no one doubts your competence anyway. The rest of us don't have that luxury. But here's where it gets interesting. That argument has it exactly backwards. Feynman didn't earn the right to say, I don't know, by becoming Feynman. He became Feynman in part because he allowed himself to say, I don't know from the very beginning. The practice preceded the reputation. The honesty was the engine of the achievement, not a reward for it. And you can start exactly where he started. Not with a Nobel Prize, not with a faculty position, with the single practice of getting rigorously honest about what you actually understand and what you're just carrying around as borrowed vocabulary. Here's another thought experiment. This one is more personal. Think of the last time you were in an intellectual conversation, and you nodded along while someone explained something you didn't actually follow. Maybe it was in a meeting. Maybe it was a lecture. Maybe it was a podcast you were half listening to. You nodded. You maybe said right. You performed comprehension. Why? Almost certainly to avoid the social cost of admitting you didn't understand. Because admitting you don't follow something feels like it reveals a deficiency. But here's what that performance actually cost you. First, you don't learn the thing. Second, you build a small pocket of false confidence, a zone in your map of knowledge where you've marked understood when the honest marking should be unclear. Third, and most insidiously, you've practiced the habit of performing understanding instead of having it. And habits compound. Feynman refused this performance his entire life. There are wonderful stories of him sitting in philosophy seminars and biology lectures and asking questions that were embarrassingly elementary from the perspective of the other attendees. Questions they felt were beneath a physicist of his stature, and he genuinely did not care, because his goal was to understand, not to appear to understand. Those are not the same goal, and choosing between them is not a small choice. It determines the entire trajectory of how you learn. Let's talk about building confidence from the ground up. Genuine confidence, not the kind that requires an audience, not the kind that collapses under pressure, but the kind that is indifferent to other people's approval because it is rooted in something more solid. Here's a framework drawn from how Feynman actually operated. First, build from the bottom. Never accept your own understanding of something as complete until you can derive it. Not memorize it, derive it. If you understand why something is true, from the most basic principles upward, you own that knowledge. It is yours. No one can take it away from you by citing an authority you haven't heard of, because you didn't get your understanding from authority in the first place. You built it from the ground up, and you know every step of the construction. Second, keep an honest ledger. At any given moment, you should be able to say, not to anyone else, just to yourself, here is what I genuinely understand, and here is what I only think I understand, and here is what I don't understand at all. Most people blur these three categories together because the blurring feels safer. Feynman never blurred them. The ledger was always precise, always honest, always updated. Third, make peace with the blank spaces. This is possibly the hardest part. The blank spaces in your knowledge, the things you don't know, are not a referendum on your intelligence. They are just the current edge of your map. Every map has edges. The goal is not to eliminate the edges. The goal is to know where they are and to be genuinely curious about what's beyond them rather than ashamed of the fact that you haven't been there yet. Fourth, test yourself before the world tests you. Find the weak points in your own understanding before a critic does. This is not masochism. This is strategy. The person who has already stress-tested their own thinking is simply not vulnerable to the same attacks as the person who hasn't. When someone finds a weakness in your argument, you've already been there. You know whether it's a real weakness or an apparent one. You know how to engage with it from a place of familiarity rather than panic. Fifth, separate your identity from your positions. This might be the deepest one. One of the main reasons changing our minds feels so threatening is that we've attached our sense of self to our beliefs. If my position is wrong, then I am wrong. If I was mistaken, then I am foolish. Feynman seems to have been almost constitutionally incapable of this confusion. His identity was not tied to being right, it was tied to the process of figuring things out. And if figuring things out required being wrong first, then being wrong was just part of the process. It wasn't an indictment of him, it was evidence that the process was working. Here's the third thought experiment, and this one is about how other people perceive you. Imagine two experts in the same field. Expert A is questioned about something peripheral to their specialty. They don't know the answer, but they're afraid to say so. So they give a vague, confident-sounding answer that doesn't really say anything. Expert B faces the same question. They say, I don't actually know the answer to that. I have some intuitions, but I'd want to check before I told you something confidently. Let me find out and get back to you. Now, who do you trust more? Almost universally, people trust expert B more. Not because they knew more in that moment, but because their I don't know functions as a credibility signal. It tells you that when they do say something with confidence, they mean it. Their confidence is not a performance, it's information. This is one of the most counterintuitive truths of intellectual life. Admitting ignorance increases your credibility, not decreases it, because it tells people your confidence is calibrated, and a calibrated source of information is infinitely more useful than an overconfident one. Feynman understood this intuitively, and it shaped the way people related to him. When he said he didn't know something, you believed him. And when he said he did know something, when he made a claim with certainty, you believed him even more because you knew his certainty was earned, not performed. Now, let's bring this into the realm of daily practice. Because everything we've discussed so far is intellectually interesting, but intellectual interest alone changes nothing. When you hear a new idea, any new idea, resist the urge to immediately accept it or immediately reject it. Sit in the middle for a moment. Ask yourself, what would it take for this to be true? What would it take for this to be false? What do I actually know that's relevant here, and what am I just assuming? When you're challenged on something you believe, notice your first internal response before you speak. Is that response coming from a place of genuine engagement with the challenge, Or is it coming from social fear, from the desire to protect your position because changing it publicly feels humiliating? Those are two very different responses, and they will lead you to very different places if you let them drive your behavior. When you catch yourself performing understanding rather than having it, stop. It takes courage. Say, "I'm not sure I followed that," or "Can you explain that differently?" It feels vulnerable. It is vulnerable. And it is also every single time the right thing to do. And when you feel the onset of imposter syndrome, that quiet, gnawing sense that you don't really belong, that everyone else understands things you don't, that you're one sharp question away from being exposed, try Feynman's move. Get specific. Ask yourself not, "Do I know enough?" but what specifically do I understand, and what specifically don't I understand? Make the map. Look at the map. The monster in the fog is almost always smaller than the fog itself. Here's what all of this is pointing toward: mental resilience. Real, durable, Feynman-level mental resilience is not a personality trait you either have or you don't. It is a set of practices built over time that eventually become a way of being. And those practices are available to everyone who chooses them. The core of it is this: trust your understanding, not your image of yourself as someone who understands. These are very different things. Your image can be threatened, and your image can collapse. Your actual understanding, once you truly have it, is yours forever. No critic can extract it. No failure can take it away. No imposter syndrome can destabilize it, because imposter syndrome feeds on the gap between how you appear and how you actually are. And when you close that gap, when you build from the ground up, test yourself honestly, and maintain a precise ledger of what you know and don't know, the gap disappears. The confidence Feynman had was not given to him. It was not a function of his intelligence, which, while formidable, was not so far beyond other brilliant physicists that it explains his particular kind of equanimity. It was the product of a lifelong practice of intellectual honesty, of choosing real understanding over performed understanding, every single day until that choice became automatic. He could walk into any room, face any challenge, answer any question, including the questions whose honest answer was, "I don't know," without his identity flinching, because his identity was rooted in the process, not the outcome, and the love of figuring things out, not the need to have figured things out already. Stop. Think about that for a moment. What would it change for you if your intellectual confidence were rooted in your process rather than your conclusions? If being wrong were not a threat to your identity, but simply a step in your method? If "I don't know" were a beginning rather than an admission of failure? Everything, probably. Almost everything. Feynman once said, and this is worth sitting with, "I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong." That is the posture of a genuinely free intellect. Not free from doubt, saturated with doubt in fact, but free from the need to resolve that doubt through performance rather than understanding. Free from the social coercion that turns intellectual life into a status competition rather than a genuine inquiry. You don't have to be a Nobel Prize winner to operate this way. You don't have to be a physicist or a genius or someone with an unusually high tolerance for uncertainty. You just have to decide, every day, in every intellectual encounter, to choose the actual territory over the comfortable map, to be more interested in what's true than in appearing to know what's true. That decision made repeatedly builds something that no credential can build and no critic can dismantle. It builds a mind that knows itself, that trusts itself, that can hold enormous knowledge and enormous humility simultaneously without contradiction, because it is understood that those two things are not opposites. They are, as Feynman spent his whole life demonstrating, the very same thing. The universe is vast and strange and mostly unknown, and we get to spend our brief, brilliant lives trying to understand it a little better than we did yesterday. Not to win, not to appear smart, not to impress anyone, just to know. And if that isn't worth getting comfortable with not knowing, nothing is.